Whenever I hear the words Appalachian Mountains, by myself, and at night, I just know it's going to be a scary story. So let's jump right in because tonight's story, all of that happened. So grab your favorite tea and settle in, and let me tell you another scary Appalachia story, because of course, this is Tea After Midnight. This story comes from AJ. My name is AJ, and here's what happened when I was 18. My family owns a small portion of land that's a part of the Appalachian Mountains. It's roughly 23.5 acres, and it's been in the family for a long time. I've been going since I was a baby every year, during spring and fall time especially. But ever since one night I went by myself, I will never go again without someone. My family's land has several family members' ashes spread on it, and one of which is my grandmother. Since her passing, anytime I would get upset, I would go and talk to her where her ashes were spread because it felt as if she was still with me. My grandmother was my best friend, and I just missed talking to her. I've gone numerous times by myself to speak to her, but this night was different. This day in particular, I was having a rough time, so I decided it was time to go sit with her since it had been a while. It was late fall and roughly 10 p.m. when I left my house to go to the land. On my way up the mountain, I smelled this awful rotting smell, but of course thought it was a dead animal. As I was driving, I was looking along both sides of the road and didn't see one, but assumed an animal was dead somewhere in the tree lines. I pulled up to the property and unlocked the gate, but before I got out of my car, my radio was going static. I didn't think anything of it because it's a mountain, so there's spots where it will go in and out. I got out and unlocked the gate to head into the property. When I got back in my car, I swore for a minute there was a shadow sitting in my back seat when I looked in my rearview mirror. But when I turned around, it was gone. I was starting to get anxious, but it's nighttime, so I brushed it off against my better judgment, thinking my eyes were playing tricks because I had been crying. Heading into the property again, my radio was going in and out, so I turned it off and continued to the opening where we have a fire pit and spots for our tents. When I got to the spot where my grandmother's ashes were spread, I parked and left my car running with the headlights facing me so I could see and sit down with her. I just started talking and was crying, telling her everything going on in my life. After a while, I heard screams, and again, trying to be logical, I thought it was a fox cry because of how high-pitched and far it was. After a while, I started to get a feeling like I was being watched. And the smell of dead animals started getting stronger, coming from the main road, so I was getting ready to leave. I looked down at my phone and realized I had been there for hours talking, and now it was roughly 1:30 a.m. I started to say my goodbyes, told her I missed her, and when I stood up, I looked into the trees, and there she was. My grandmother, standing by one of the bigger trees to the right, roughly 30 feet away. For a split second, I felt pure happiness and wanted to run towards her, but immediately realized it couldn't be her. I just felt pure terror. She then smiled, and that's when it clicked. It wasn't her. Not only because she'd been gone for years, but her features were off, and when she smiled, I just knew something was trying to be her. It's like the moment I realized whatever it was could tell, and her features started to change from human to animalistic. It looked like her still, but her eyes glowed and flickered in the light only the way an animal's do. Her smile was filled with rotted, jagged teeth, and the dead animal smell was so heavy in the air, I started feeling sick to my stomach. Her eyes locked on mine, still smiling. I watched her pull herself behind the tree. She was gone, and I was locked in fear because all of a sudden I heard something in the distance and heavy running sounds through the woods. I ran so fast to my car, and when I got in, I locked my doors and was trying to find my phone, but quickly realized I left it where I had been sitting. I started sobbing because I did not want to get out to go get my phone, but I had to so I could record myself in case something happened. I took a deep breath, opened my car door, bolted to the spot I'd been sitting, quickly found my phone, and when I got up to turn to my car, there she was. I saw her standing the same distance away from my car, but behind it. Still smiling and eyes staring into me, she started mimicking me. I was too afraid to run and didn't blink, even with the headlights beaming, out of fear she would disappear. As I slowly walked to my driver's side door with my eyes locked on her, she slowly made her way to my passenger side, making a step at the same time I did. We were face to face, and up close I could see her rotted flesh like skin, and it was saggy, eyes almost bulging out of her head, locked on me. Her teeth were thick, jagged, and thorn-like, and it looked like she had a thick liquid coming out. The smell was so pungent that the best way I could describe it was death. I was staring at what I can best describe as the most malevolent and vile thing that no longer looked like her, and she was way taller now, too. Still staring, I slowly reached for my driver's side door handle, and out of the corner of my eye, it was reaching for the passenger handle. I swung my door open, jumped in my car, slammed the door, and tried driving off, but my car would not go. It had been running for a few hours and now doesn't want to go. I started sobbing hysterically because my radio was going from low to high, static, in and out. I turned my phone on and started recording, screaming, saying my full name and saying if anything happens to me, I did not run away, and there's something with me, please just leave me alone, something is here. Just screaming for it to stop and to let me go, all while trying to get my car to go after shifting in and out of drive because it would simply not drive off. I finally slammed it into drive for what felt like the 100th time and peeled out of there, leaving the family gate open. I was speeding home. Once leaving the mountain, my radio went back to silence like it was when I originally got to my family's land. I'm now 24 and absolutely refuse to go to the land by myself and have taken several precautions with whatever seemed to attach itself to me. To this day, I haven't seen what I saw that night, but I always feel like something is watching me, and when I do stay the night on camping trips, I always wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. hearing screams. Several other family members have had encounters here, but not like this. This one will haunt me forever. I truly think if I hadn't locked my doors prior to getting out, something would have happened because my driver's side was the only one unlocked when I got out to get my phone. I have the recording on my phone somewhere of me in my car freaking out, and remember when I showed my boyfriend, now fiancé, a couple days after the instance. He paused the video because he saw a quick white flash behind me, and you just see a blurred, slim, and tall grayish white figure running past my driver's side. To this day, I haven't gone back to talk with my Nan alone, especially at night, because of whatever it was that took her form. I've had several encounters, but nothing like this, and hopefully never encounter it again. So there was just a little bit more to the end of this email. They were basically just saying thank you for me reading their story, but also based on the research that they've done, they think they saw a flesh pedestrian, if you will. And honestly, I have to agree. It's either that or a mimic, but either way you go, it's equally as terrifying. I truly don't know what I would do in that situation if I was out there at night by myself and no one's around. So what do? Like, you're just sitting there and you see this absolutely terrifying creature type thing that is taking the form of your grandmother. It's just beyond me. That is so scary. I'm just so glad that they were okay and they made it out of there safely. But the car not starting at the end, I don't even know. I'm so glad that it eventually started, but it seems like every single time something bad's happening, you need to get out of there as fast as possible, the car won't start. But AJ, I just want to say thank you so much for sending your story. That is utterly terrifying, but I'm so glad that you made it out of there safely. And truthfully, I do agree with you. I think you either saw that or I think you saw a mimic. But again, either way you go, equally terrifying. But that does conclude this episode of Tea After Midnight. If you have any personal scary stories you want to share, I would love to read them. You can email me at the email on the screen or the email in the caption of this video. But as always, you guys, I love you more than you know. I hope you have the best night, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.
I got an email from a girl who said that she bought an Annabelle doll and this doll ended up hurting her. Now this girl is brave because not only did she buy the Annabelle doll, but she also bought the Chucky doll and the Robert doll, the Ouija board, and she did all this because she loves horror. She said that she truly believes that all these dolls that come from movies truly have something attached to it. So last October, she goes to a garage sale. She finds an Annabelle doll. She buys the doll and she takes it home. Immediately when she takes it home and she opens up the packaging, she gets the Annabelle doll out and she just feels like she shouldn't have bought it. Immediately, she gets this horrible feeling. Well, she kind of ignores the feeling, and later on that night, she gets ready for bed, she goes to sleep, she wakes up in the middle of the night, and she can't move. And she realizes almost immediately that she's having sleep paralysis. And so she's just laying there, kind of like, damn it. And then she notices something. She looks over at the corner of her room next to her bed where the chair is. The Annabelle doll is there, except for the Annabelle doll is not by itself. It's sitting on the lap of this strange black figure that had horns. She is horrified at this point, so she starts praying in her head. And immediately when she starts praying, she's still looking at this figure, and she sees this figure's face change. It goes from like this evil, like grin expression to just being angry. And all of a sudden she just wakes up. Now, this sleep paralysis incident scared her so badly that she couldn't fall asleep for the rest of the night. And you would think at this point that she would have given the doll away or gotten rid of the doll, but she didn't. She kept it. Now, this started becoming a regular occurrence for her. She would go to bed, she would wake up in the middle of the night, and she would look over at that chair, and she would see the Annabelle doll sitting in the lap of this figure with horns. One night she goes to bed, she wakes up in the middle of the night, same thing happens again, but this time she has had enough of this. She's horrified. So she remembers something. She remembers something that someone told her, and that was if you move a little tiny body part, any body part, your finger, your mouth, your toes, your ankle, you can wake up out of sleep paralysis. So she does just that, but she chooses to move her right ankle. She like moves her ankle and her foot like this, or that's what she's trying to do. She's eventually able to do it, and she pulls herself out of the sleep paralysis. Well, she falls asleep and she wakes up the next day and she's getting ready for the day, and she goes to walk out of her room and she goes to walk down the stairs. And as soon as she gets to the first step, something behind her shoves her down the stairs, and she ends up breaking her right ankle. At this point, she knows that whatever this is, whatever is happening to her, it has to do with that doll. And so she's had enough of the doll. And so she wants to return the doll at this point. And this is the craziest part of the story. Apparently, somehow she had gotten the number of the person who had given her the doll, and she tried to call that number, and the number was just out of order. It was like it was non-existent. And she decides that at this point she's going to go to the house. So she drives to the house and she pulls up and she notices that something is wrong. The house does not look occupied at all. So she walks up to the door and she realizes that this house is abandoned. So she's like, there's no way. I was just at this house. I know I bought this doll from this house. They had a garage sale. I was just here. I know I was. So they walk over to the neighbor's house, whoever's with her, she didn't say. And they knock on the neighbor's door. And they're like, hey, we're just wondering, do you know if somebody who lived here just like a couple days ago, if maybe they had moved out? Do you know the owner of the person who used to live here? And their neighbor says, that house has been abandoned for 30 years. Last thing she said in the email is that she's not sure who that was that gave her that doll, but she does not think that they were human. So what did you guys think about that story? I know that story was short, but I figured you'd like it because it had to do with an Annabelle doll. I wonder what Annabelle doll this was. I didn't even know. I'm sure they sell Annabelle dolls and the Robert doll. The Robert doll, getting the Robert doll, just to let you know, is not smart. I don't even think getting like a replica of the Robert doll is smart. I know you didn't get the actual Robert doll, but you are brave for getting that doll. I will do a video about that doll. That doll is just infamous for causing like deaths, for causing accidents, for causing turmoil in people's lives, devastating events. Like, it's actually insane. I'm pretty sure that doll gets like hundreds of letters a year mailed to the museum that he's in, apologizing to him for making fun of him in the museum, because people will go there and see him in the museum and they'll make fun of him in the museum, and then they'll leave and something devastating will happen, or their life will just fall apart, or someone will pass away. Like, it's actually insane. So you're super brave for doing that. I get it. You love horror. You like to collect horror things, but I'm just glad you're okay and that something crazier didn't happen. Do you guys see, hold on, let me see if it's that. Do you guys see this like fog around my videos recently? I wonder if I need to get a new phone, because that's in like all my videos. It's driving me nuts. But anyways, now that I've ranted, tell me what all your thoughts, opinions, and suggestions are about the story. Drop them below because I would love to hear them.
These are the only earrings I had to match an orange theme, okay? If these didn't scare you, this story for sure will. So this guy says that growing up, he was a big skeptic. He never believed in the paranormal, and unfortunately, something did happen to him to change that mindset. He's like, I wish I could go back to that. I wish I could go back to the days where I would confidently tell people that the paranormal did not exist, but unfortunately, he cannot. He said that this happened recently in like a foresty area from where he's from, where there's was a street that was just like a 1 lane going, 1 lane coming, and it's because they like going camping there. He says that normally a lot of them go, which take up a lot of cars, even an RV, but this time it was only 2 groups of people and 2 cars. So in his car, it was his girlfriend and his sister. And in the other car, it was his best friend with his 2 brothers. One was 15 and one was 11. Apparently, he had just bought this car, so he didn't have it for a long time, which is why he's like, just wait for the stupidity that happened with my car. So they were already done camping. They were on the road to go back home, and it was nighttime, and that is when his tire literally exploded. Now, this is where the stupidity part came to play, because he says that he did have a spare tire. He never realized that that spare tire was a completely different size than the rest of his tires. Obviously, he couldn't use that spare, and the spare that his friend had in his car was also not the right size for his car. They actually remembered that not too far from there was like a little small town, and they remember seeing a tire shop there. His friend agreed to go to that tire shop, bring back the tire and fix it. However, he says that he had the urge that he couldn't leave his car alone there. However, his girlfriend and his sister had the complete opposite vibe, where they were like, I don't want to be here. I want to go with the friend to go get the tire. His friend's sibling, the boy that was 15 years old, he's like, oh, I'll stay with you. That way they can go and get the tire and come back and you won't be here alone. However, after about a few minutes, he completely changed his mind too. He's like, actually, I don't want to stay here with you. I'm gonna go get the tire with them. He explains how they were all cramped up in his friend's car, but everybody had the same like vibe where it's like, we don't want to stay here. We'd rather be cramped up and go get the tire for you. He knew that it was gonna be about a 40-minute wait, so he decided to lean his seat back and just take a nap. He started dreaming that somebody was knocking on the door, but then he realized that it wasn't a dream and somebody was knocking on his door. However, when he turned to look at the windows or at the other side, there was nobody standing or anybody outside of that car. He decided that maybe he was dreaming, so he just decided to go back to sleep, but that was the moment where something hit the top of his car. He opened his window a little bit and he thought maybe there was an animal there, but he didn't want to get off to see. He just hit the roof of his car to scare off whatever animal was on top of the car. However, that did not happen. That's when he started to hear like if somebody had their hand on the roof of the car and was tapping every single finger like one by one. Whatever was making those tapping noises definitely was making them with the intention of him hearing them. And he realized that it was definitely a hand. From far away, he could see that a car was getting closer to him that was also in the direction of that small town. So when his tire actually exploded, he parked his car like really close to the forest, away from the street. And in that moment, he had regrets because he was like, if I was in the street right now, whoever was passing by could have at least seen what the fuck was on top of my car, so that maybe if they saw whatever was on top of the car, they would stop and ask for help. But yeah, like he had a lot of regrets just putting his car by the forest. However, the car didn't stop. It just passed by him without stopping. But he said that when the car did that, he was able to see the shadow of his car. He could see the shadow of his car on the dirt that was on the other side. The car had the high beams on, so he was able to see the shadow, the silhouette of his car. He was able to make out what was on top of his car, or at least a shadow of it. He explains that it looked like a human, like sitting on top of his car on all fours. He can also see that the shadow of this humanoid's head was really close to his side of the window where the driver's seat was. In that moment, he obviously got so scared that he turned his car on, and he didn't know why he did that, because obviously it's not like he could drive off, but he ended up locking all the doors, putting the windows up, and blasting music at full volume. Every now and again, even through the music, he could still hear something banging on the roof. After what felt like forever, he said that he saw that there was a truck coming his way, and he realized that it was like a work truck. It wasn't the car that his friend was in, but it did stop next to him. He did not dare get off the car until he saw that the guy got off his truck and was coming near his car. When he finally gets off of his car, he obviously looks back and sees that there is nothing on his car, but he also thought it was fucking weird because he never felt this thing get off his car. He never heard it like get off or anything like that. This is why he thinks that it's not a human. It wasn't somebody that was trying to rob him, because he feels like if it was a human getting off of his car, he would have seen it, he would have felt it. They wouldn't have just like made a move that he couldn't see. So this tire guy is going to help him, but ends up telling him that his friends did tell him that they were going to bring the tire, but at the end they didn't want to come back for whatever reason, and they paid the guy to bring the tire to his friend. So he says that the guy looked completely normal. He wasn't scared until he turned turned to look at him, and he noticed that he didn't look directly at him, but beyond him. But he also looked up towards one of the trees, and that is when he got really nervous, and he looked at him and says, hey, we need to get this tire on. We need to get out of here as quickly as possible. The guy very quickly puts the tire on. He starts putting his tools in his truck, and he's like, I don't even want to walk back to my car. I don't even want to look behind me. I don't want to see anything. He explains how he got in his car without looking back, and he tried to stay behind the guy, the tire guy in the truck. But he says that obviously this guy's truck was really old and he didn't give a fuck about what happened to his car. The guy was speeding away from there and he couldn't keep up with him. When he finally makes it back to his girlfriend, sisters, friend, none of them could like explain to him why they couldn't stay with him or why they had that urge to not stay there or why they wouldn't even go back for him. They just explained to him that they just felt something was off, like something in the wind, something in the forest that like made them not want to stay there. You want to know the most fucked up part out of this whole story? Even after he left, they went back home, he explains that he would be waking up by the sounds of like the finger tapping one by one in his bedroom window. He would wake up to the sounds and he would not dare to open his eyes and look towards that window. Wait, is that too slow? I'm scaring myself. No. Bitch, if I hear that shit, there was a window behind me. I know, green screen window behind me right now. But thank God it's 3 p.m. and it is not nighttime.
First, I wasn't sure if it was all in my head. Maybe it would be considered a haunting, but now I think I know what to call it. A curse.
Oh, wow.
And I do fear by telling you this story, it may pass on to you. Continue at your own risk. My story begins a year ago when I was in my final year of uni, and actually originates with one of my course mates. We're having a girls' night round at my uni house, about 10 of us having a wine and a gossip. As the night got later and outside got darker, my housemates and I started sharing creepy stories of supernatural things we'd experienced in our shared house that we thought was haunted. A story for another day. And that's when one of the girls, let's call her Leah, said that she had her own scary story. Leah told us that all her life she'd seen the woman. The woman seemed at first to exist only in her dreams. Tall, unnaturally tall, with a crooked neck to stop her reaching the ceiling. Long dark hair. The woman would appear frequently standing in the corner of Leah's childhood bedroom. Watching her, Leah said she could always sense when the woman was coming, as her skin would prick and she'd be filled with a sense of dread when getting into bed, like when you hear a strange noise when you're home alone, or that cold that strikes through you, as if you know something's not right. She would be paralysed when she saw her, unable to move, to speak, to look away. The woman would infiltrate Leah's dreams, existing in the corner of her mind. Sometimes the woman would speak. I had you when you were 1. I had you when you were 2. I had you when you were 3. I had you. The woman would count right up until Leah's current age, and then Leah would awake, gasping and sweaty as if escaping her. She'd never quite reached Leah's actual age, and Leah didn't know what would happen if the woman ever did. This continued right up until Leah was 18, and moving out of her family home to go to university. Once she'd moved out, Leah didn't see the woman again. The dream stopped completely, and she quickly moved on and didn't give the woman another thought. Until Christmas came, and Leah was going back to visit her family. The first night, she slept in her childhood room again. The woman was back, and she was furious. As usual, Leah was paralysed, body stiff and broken. The woman always appeared in the corner of the room, and she was mumbling under her breath, growing louder and louder. She was counting again. I had you and you, I had you and you. Suddenly, the woman broke from her trance and launched for Leah, screaming, jumping onto the bed and pinning her arms down, with gnarled fingers and long, sharp nails digging into her skin. You left me, you left me, you left me, you left me. She wailed this into Leah's face, and as she did, blood started pouring from her mouth, dripping down onto Leah's face, her body, her bed, and eventually pooling onto the floor. Leah couldn't move, frozen there, staring into the woman's red, bulging eyes until eventually she awoke, dripping with sweat, out of breath, her room still dark. Leah swung her legs out the bed, shaking, planning to run to the bathroom to throw up, but her feet landed in a wet puddle. Blood. The woman's blood. And suddenly, there she was, standing in the corner. For the first time ever, Leah could scream. But as she did, the woman ran towards her again, and this time pinning her by her throat back against her bed, the woman's body holding her down like a weight as she screamed, "I had you when you were 16. I had you when you were 17. I'll have you now you're 18. Leah said that dream repeated over and over that night until she finally woke up, and since then, when she visits home, she refuses to sleep in that room, and instead stays with other family or friends. She was terrified of what it would mean now that the woman could reach her actual age. Strangely, she said people who have slept in her room since have never experienced anything like this, and she's never seen the woman ever again. It was all we could talk about for the rest of the night. All of us morbidly fascinated, wondering if it was just a dream, maybe sleep paralysis, and maybe her room was haunted. How naive we all were. That night, when everyone had left, my housemate and my best mate, Abby, said she was scared to go to bed. I laughed, but Abby was serious. I just said goodnight and went upstairs to bed while Abby stayed in her downstairs bedroom. Despite the spooky story and my overactive imagination, I slept fine. That next morning, Abby wasn't waiting for me downstairs to walk to uni like we usually did. She was a famous early bird who'd always be sat there with some breakfast, but not today. I knocked on her bedroom door. "You ready, Abs?" Silence. Slightly concerned, I pushed open her door ever so slightly to check if she was still in bed. Maybe she'd left without me and wasn't actually home, but no. There she was, lying in bed, shaking. I ran straight away into her bedroom, terrified she was having a medical emergency, like maybe she was ill, or maybe she was having a seizure. "Abby, can you hear me?" Standing over her, I realised her eyes were closed and she was mumbling, her whole body jittering. "Abby," I shouted, and suddenly her eyes shot open. She sat up straight, almost slamming right into me. She was breathing heavily, almost crying, holding her throat. "The woman," she said, quietly, staring at the corner of the room. I looked, but there was nothing there. "Did you have a nightmare?" I started, but Abby interrupted me, pale and still shaking. "She was there. She held me down. I saw her. She said she'd have me." If she wasn't so genuinely scared, I would have accused her of trying to frighten me, using Leah's story to mess with me, but she was terrified. Eventually, we got her sorted, went to uni, where Abby spoke to Leah about what she'd seen, about the nightmare she had. At the time, we chalked it up to how, with all the alcohol and scary experiences being shared, Abby must have just gotten into her head and her brain had focused on it. But Abby insisted it was more than a dream, that it felt real, to the extent that she put a lock on her door, convinced a woman actually broke into the house.
God.
I thought it was maybe sleep paralysis, a shared psychosis, or everyone trying to freak each other out. Until it happened again. Now this is where it gets really strange. I worked at a popular local pub, and I was there one night closing with one of my favourite supervisors. The one who told me about ghost hunts in the first place.
Yeah, stunning.
She liked spooky stuff, so I told her about Leah's story. Exactly the same as I've told you, and about how Abby suddenly became afflicted with the same dream. My supervisor was invested, but eventually laughed it off, agreeing that Abby must have just hopped on the bandwagon and convinced herself she saw the same thing. I got a call later that night. Hours after we'd finished work, I woke to my phone ringing, and it was my supervisor. Very confused, I answered. "She's here."
Oh,
"What? Who?" I asked. But I knew.
I'll put the phone down and move.
The woman. She was here. In my room. The long hair, the red eyes, the sharp nails, I felt it. She said she'd have me. My supervisor sounded like she was going to be sick and her voice was trembling. I managed to calm her down that night and my supervisor never mentioned it again. But at this point, I was worried. I didn't tell anyone else about the woman in fear I was feeding this fantastical mass hysteria. This was about a year ago now, and since then all of us have moved away from our uni town and I've lost contact with Leah and some of the other girls who were there that night. So I don't know if they've experienced anything since. Abby doesn't like talking about it. Leah, Abby, and my supervisor. It felt like too much to be a coincidence, but as time went on and life moved on, I moved back home and forgot all about it, to be honest. Then last week, the woman finally came for me.
Oh, no.
I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, nor do I have particularly vivid dreams, so when I felt myself wake up but be unable to move my body, I was instantly scared, and then I felt it. The sensation of being watched, of knowing something's not as it should be. My eyes drifted from my closed bedroom door over my desk to the corner of my room, and there she was. I've never felt terror like it. My whole body went cold. Tears were welling in my eyes instantly, and my heart was beating so fast I wanted to run, to be sick, to scream, but I could only lie there. She was more horrifying than I could ever have imagined or described. Even thinking about it now makes me shiver. She was looming over me. Her neck was so twisted as if it was broken. Those bloodshot eyes were glaring into mine, and her hair was knotted and brushing against my body as she slowly edged closer to my face. I had you when you were one. I had you when you were two. She started, her voice raspy and cracking. Her lips were dry and skin was rotten as if a corpse reanimated. I tried my best to move, to close my eyes, but it was as if I was tied down. Her voice got louder and louder as she got closer to my age. I had you when you were 22. Before she reached 23, blood suddenly started streaming out of her mouth, out of her eyes, covering me, drowning me. I could taste it in my throat, running up my nostrils, burning my eyes, and at some point, I started screaming with her. I woke up to my partner shaking me awake, but I wasn't in bed. I was standing in the corner of my own bedroom. My partner said she'd been woken by me screaming in my sleep, and when she turned the light on, she realised I wasn't in bed, but instead standing where I'd seen the woman.
Oh, God.
I haven't slept since. I keep the light on all night. I play podcasts, anything to prevent utter darkness or silence and fear that she'll appear again. I've gotten sleeping tablets from the doctors that knock me into an unconscious sleep so deep that no dreams can reach me. I beg my partner to stay awake until I've been knocked out, as if that would deter the woman. I don't know why she's come for me now, and I don't know how long she intends to stay. I no longer believe she's a dream, because I see her when I'm awake. Quick slivers of darkness around corners of my vision, a blink of a reflection in a mirror. I think Leah cursed us back then.
God.
It spread to Abby, and then when I passed the story on, it spread to my supervisor. And now, I fear it may spread to you both too. I can only apologise, but maybe then she'll leave me in peace. Please do update in future episodes if you see the woman. I'm an equal parts terrified and intrigued to see if sharing my story maybe passes her on to someone new and alleviates me, or perhaps she'll spread to all of us.
Let's read another scary story that was sent to us. I would like to remain anonymous, but I feel compelled to share a story from my time living in Arkansas. It began when me and my sister were moved after a house fire to Greer's Ferry, Arkansas, to a trailer in the holler with a bluff and a creek behind, and woods with caves. I was 15 and my sister was 16. We shared the master bedroom of an old double-wide trailer, and our twin beds were positioned on opposite sides of the room. We had 2 closet doors on the other side of the room, a dresser at the end of her bed, and my dresser in the corner of the end of my bed with the TV on it to complete the layout. While we initially heard odd noises, the activity escalated significantly between late night hours, around 3 and 5 a.m. Our closet doorknobs would rattle violently by something or someone, even though nothing was ever there, and our beds would shake with such force it felt as though someone were trapped beneath the mattresses, shaking them from beneath. When we would run to the other's bed, it would stop, but we were still terrified. We tried our best to ignore the occurrences, especially since our mother refused to believe us. The activity soon turned aggressive. Items would fly off the bathroom counters as if thrown in a fit of rage, and the DVD player would repeatedly power on and off, its tray sliding open and shut on its own. We even began to hear low, distinct whispers. Even friends who stayed over would see a low shadow scurry across the floor, scaring us all. The situation reached a breaking point one night. My sister, who has always been more sensitive to the spiritual world, was sound asleep. I awoke to the sound of low, rhythmic murmurs and shadows, and I looked over toward her side of the dimly lit room. I saw a tall, dark entity looming over her, flanked by multiple shorter shadow figures. This central figure was so immense it had to hunch over to fit beneath the ceiling. It was emaciated, looking as though black skin had been shrink-wrapped over a skeleton, with unnervingly long, lanky limbs and glowing eyes. Paralyzed with fear, I texted my mother multiple times and tried calling, but she told me to go back to bed. At that moment, my blood ran cold as the entity shifted its gaze towards me. I called out for my mother again, but when she entered the room, she simply told me I was dreaming and urged me to go back to sleep. A few days later, I mentioned the incident to my sister. She admitted she had seen the same entity lurking in our room, but hadn't wanted to frighten me. We eventually moved back to Michigan, and for a while, I believed the haunting had ended. However, at age 20, shortly after returning home from the hospital with my newborn daughter, I caught a fleeting glimpse of that same figure watching me through the glass of the exterior door. I had even woken up with a burning sensation, and my mother looked at my arm, and there was a long handprint that was red and raised on my arm. The fingers wrapped around long enough to touch, much too big for anyone in the house. While neither my sister nor I saw it again after that, and we both have moved out, the entity seemed to appear again to my ex, who currently lives with my mother and grandmother. He began experiencing severe night terrors and sleep paralysis, conditions he had never suffered from before. When he finally described the figure from his nightmares, my sister and I were shaken to the core. Without us ever having told him or anyone else our story, he described the exact same skeletal black entity we had lived with years prior. Realizing the attachment still lingered, he began practicing spiritual protection to ward it off. Thankfully, no one has seen it in 2 years. Okay, so I asked the person who sent me this story, their ex-boyfriend still lives with their mom and grandma. But as we heard in the story, they have not seen the entity again. And thank goodness, because honey, I'd have to be moving out if I saw that in my house.
Y'all have to hear this glitch in the matrix time loop gas station story time and tell me what you think. If you know, you know. But this is another one. This came from someone named Rusty. And Rusty says this took place about 10 years ago when he was 28 and working at a small gas station in Alabama. The place was nothing fancy. It had just a few pumps. And it was the kind of place that had the same burnt coffee that they never changed and a lottery machine that beeped every time the tickets ran low. But Rusty had worked there for 2 years. And he says that he knew every crack in the floor tile and most of the people that came into the gas station because it was a small town and they didn't see too much outside traffic. Rusty worked primarily overnights, and he said he mostly liked the job. It was very low effort. He didn't have to do much. But the thing that annoyed him most about the job was that he and his coworkers joked that pump 2 was cursed. And the reason it was cursed was because the display would always reset to 0.00 on both the price and the gas. And so people who were unfamiliar with this gas station and that pump always came in and had to have them come out and reset it by just pressing a little red reset button. And it annoyed Rusty because it just caused him to have to walk outside for people who didn't know any better. And they had alerted management, they had alerted corporate, and every time they would send somebody out to fix it and they would say it's fixed, but it never was fixed. The night the story takes place was a Thursday, and Rusty says he knows this because the beer delivery had come earlier that day and he was in the middle of putting it away when a beat up silver Tacoma pulls into the lot, and it pulls up to pump number 2, and Rusty sees it outside and he's immediately annoyed because he knows he's going to have to go out there because he doesn't recognize the truck. But a man gets out and he has neck tattoos and he has broad shoulders, and Rusty recognized the guy as soon as he stepped out of his truck, not because he knew the guy, but because he recognized him from his mugshot that had been circulating on social media among his friend group, because the guy lived about a town or two over and had recently been released from the state jail or prison after serving out a sentence for severely beating 2 men a few years prior in a bad bar fight that put both of the men in the ICU. Rusty says not a whole lot goes on in that town, so when something like this happens, the whole county hears about it. And so everybody had seen this guy's mugshot. And what Rusty remembered from it was that the guy had dead eyes. He said he looked like the kind of guy that you just did not want to run into in a dark alley. He looks like the kind of guy that made him want to lock the door before the guy even stepped inside. But the guy pulls up to the pump, he fills up without problem, and then he comes in. Rusty said he hadn't even been outside to reset the pump that night, so he wasn't sure how the guy managed to fill up, but he doesn't ask any questions. Obviously, the guy walks in, he grabs a honey bun from the snack aisle, he goes and he gets a drink from a cooler, and then he walks to the counter and he asks for a tobacco product behind the counter. Rusty hands it to him, he charges him, and the guy doesn't say hello or anything, but he says, "Is pump 2 still acting up?" Rusty says, "Yeah, it always does. How'd you know?" And the guy doesn't smile or anything, but he said, "You about to eat your turkey sandwich?" And Rusty said that struck him as odd because he had the same turkey sandwich every day at 2:30 in the morning. He looks at the clock and it's 1:47, and he said his stomach dropped because not even his girlfriend knows about his turkey sandwich routine. He started to panic because he thought that maybe this guy had been casing the place since his release from jail. It was a real possibility because Rusty worked alone, and he said anyone who came into the store late at night on a regular basis would have known this. So maybe this guy had friends on the outside who told him that he would be alone and that this gas station could have been a prime target. But as Rusty's having these thoughts, the guy pipes up again and he says, "Let me ask you a question. When I stepped out of my truck, did you go back to the switch on the ice machine to flip the security monitor so you could watch the back lot, the same that you do every time you feel watched?" And that was also an odd comment because Rusty said that was a private thing that he did anytime he just felt a little bit spooked in the store, but nobody knew about it, not even the people he worked with. So he goes, "Look, man, I don't know you. You've never been in here." And then this guy smiles for the first time and he puts his stuff down on the counter and he leans toward Rusty. He goes, "Let me tell you something. On the inside, I was part of this neural mapping program. That's how I got out early." He tells him it was voluntary, that it was a memory mapping experiment, and that they paired them with civilians on the outside through some kind of helmet that they were testing for the feds. And they said, "You got out early if you finished a full year." He said, they told us it was all simulated data, that it was all fake, but it felt real to me, like I could actually see what was going on outside, and I got out 6 months early because of it. And then he laughs and he says, I guess they picked you as my civilian. Rusty doesn't even know what to say at this point, but the guy just grabs his change, he grabs his stuff, and he heads back out to the parking lot, gets in his truck, and Rusty watches as his taillights disappear down the dark road. Rusty has no idea what to make of the situation. He is still standing there stunned, trying to figure out what just happened, when 10 minutes later at 1:57, the same beat-up silver Tacoma pulls into the gas station and pulls up to pump 2. This same guy gets out of the truck, he fills up at the pump, he comes into the gas station, no hellos, eyes just darting around, grabs his honey bun, grabs his drink, and comes to the counter and asks for a tobacco product behind the register, and then looks at Rusty straight in the eye and says, pump 2 still acting up? Rusty says he felt like he was going to throw up all over the counter. The register tape showed the first transaction at 1:47. But now here he was ringing it all up over again. And he says, weren't you just here, man? And the guy leans on the counter and he goes, let me tell you something about that program. They said the memories would fade, but yours just got stronger. That's why I knew you'd still be here. Rusty said he couldn't speak. He just nodded once and the guy took his change and left. As soon as the guy left a second time, Rusty said he immediately went to check the cameras, and the cameras showed the man entering the store 2 different times 10 minutes apart. But when he counted the drawer at shift change, the cash only added up to 1 sale. It was short the exact amount that the man had paid for twice. Rusty tried to explain it away as coincidence, and he tried to put the man out of his mind. A week went by with no signs of this man coming back, and he was still sort of on guard, thinking that the man may have been casing the joint, and if not, maybe it was just the ramblings of a crazy person. But the following Thursday, he was putting the beer order again when the same beat-up silver Tacoma pulls into pump 2. Rusty's stomach dropped. The man walks in, he grabs a honey bun, he grabs a drink, he comes to the counter and asks for a tobacco product. He says, pump 2 still acting up again? There's no hello, there's no smile in his eyes, and Rusty just says, what is going on with you, man? And the guy says, they told me the experiment would end when I left. He says, but I think something happened, and I keep living the same night over and over, and you're always here, but you never remember me. Rusty says, no, I remember you. You were in here last week, and we had a very similar, very strange conversation. And the guy just reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out register tape, and he hands it to him, and he says, look at this. It was for the exact same transaction dated earlier in that same night, and on the back was a little smiley face. Rusty had doodled a smiley face on the register tape earlier, except he said that man hadn't come in that night, and he had never given him that receipt. Rusty is stunned again, and he's looking around, and he's thinking that this man has now been watching him through the windows, but he doesn't understand because there's nothing around. He said he would have seen a truck had it pulled in. Even if he was in a different car, he would have seen the car. There's nowhere for someone to walk up and hide. And as he's having these thoughts, he's absentmindedly ringing up this man for this new transaction, and he hands him his change, and the man smiles again, and he says, thanks, I'll see you tomorrow. He says he never saw him again. He didn't last much longer at that job. He did end up training a new employee who he gave his phone number to, and one night when he was off work and the new employee was there shortly after starting to work by himself, that employee texted him and said, there's a man in here asking about pump 2 and where you are. He never saw the guy around town again. He no longer lives in that town, but anytime he goes back to visit family or friends and he sees a beat up silver Tacoma in his rear view, he always turns around to make sure it's not the same person. He said, I know he's still out there, and part of me wonders if he was telling me the truth.
Story comes to us from Appalachia, and it is about the little white man of Appalachia. Someone who we're just going to call in sent us the story, and she said this actually happened to her dad many years ago. Her family lives in Middle Tennessee in the foothills of Appalachia. She says that where they live is very cavernous. But she said that this is a story that her dad has always told her, and when she first heard it, she thought that it was just him trying to scare her to make sure that she didn't go outside at nighttime in the dark. But as she got older, she would ask his cousins and the people who were with him when this happened about this story, and they would all recount the exact same details. So, when Inn's dad was a boy, he was living in the foothills of Appalachia, which is where Inn lives now. She said, I am still on the same road that my dad grew up on. They lived on a farm. One night, he and his cousins and the neighbor are outside playing hide and go seek. Her dad is the last one to be found, so he's the last one to make it back to the treehouse, which is what they set up as their base. The kids are sitting there hanging out in the treehouse, and from about 100 yards away, they hear the pigs squealing, and so that gets their attention, and they look out of the treehouse, and they see this small white figure dart out of the barn. Inn's dad and the kids that he's with decide that they're going to chase this thing off just to protect the animals and the livestock. Now, at this point, they haven't gotten a super good look at this thing, but as they're chasing it and they're gaining on it and getting closer, they realize that, yeah, this thing is definitely humanoid, but this is not human. They said it was about 5 feet tall, pale skin, had a little bit of like scraggly white fur on it, and its eyes were this blazing bright blue. Now, these kids were just built different because they kept chasing it. They were like, we're protecting these animals. So they keep chasing it. They hit the wood line, and once they hit the wood line, her dad says that they lose this thing in the brush. Inn told me that her and her family are very open to talking about this story. Her dad tells this openly. His cousins tell this openly. They all have the exact same details, and in her family, it has become known as the story of the little white man. As Inn got older, she started looking into it. What could this possibly have been? And she came across something called the moon-eyed people. Moon-eyed people of Appalachia are basically said to be these small, pale, white figures with bright blue eyes that live in caves and only come out at night. Stories of the moon-eyed people have been documented since 1797. They are subterranean, nocturnal, they have amazing night vision, which is why their eyes look the way that they do. Folklore actually connects the moon-eyed people to these ancient forts built on Fort Mountain in Georgia. People will say they're called the moon-eyed people because of their bright eyes. Others will say they're called the moon-eyed people because they have night vision, so they can see at night, moon-eyed. It says that even though her dad saw this when he was little, he never saw this creature again, and she has never encountered this creature, but she says it does kind of stop her from going outside at nighttime still. Yeah, those kids were definitely built different because there's no way. Girl, there's no way. Folklore behind the moon-eyed people did start with indigenous tribes talking about seeing these things. I'm not going to go into detail with that because I am not an indigenous creator, and there are other creators on this app who are much more well-versed, and that is their history and their folklore. So that's where we're going to leave that. But I absolutely love when stories come in from Appalachia. So if you are from Appalachia and you have one, send it to me. I mean, you don't have to, but it'd be kind of cool. Anyways, I hope that everyone has a great day. I have got a really busy weekend. I'm probably going to do like 4 stories today. I'm going to save some of my drafts and I'll post them throughout the weekend. So if you see me in the same clothes, mind your business. It's the same thing. It's the same.
Here's more reasons why the city of San Fernando is considered to be the most historical and most haunted little pocket in the San Fernando Valley. And I'm sure with the background location, you guys are like, I know where that is. And of course it is one of the oldest pieces of history in San Fernando. And trust me, this one comes with many stories. Welcome to the Lopez Adobe. This little historical nugget was built in the 1880s, and it's one of the oldest surviving homes in the entire San Fernando Valley. It was once a stagecoach stop, general store, post office, basically the heart of early life. And it also started with Geronimo and Catalina Lopez, who purchased the 40 acres land near the mission in San Fernando in 1861. But this one was erected by Geronimo's cousin, Valentin. The original adobe became known as the Lopez Station, and the couple also operated the San Fernando Valley's first general store, its first English language school, and its first post office in 1869. But it seems like people just don't come here for the history. There's been a couple people who believe that there's still something that might be here. And according to one article that I read, it seems like there is a few people who have reported seeing one of the Lopez family members, which was Catalina, like a full body apparition standing upstairs, staring outside of the window. Geronimo, well, he's been seen downstairs casually sitting and smoking like he still lives there, which parallels with the accounts of people claiming that they smell cigar smoke in certain areas of the house. People have also claimed to have heard children running and laughing upstairs. So I decided to do a little impromptu investigation.
So I'm standing here at the Casa Lopez here in San Fernando, and I don't have any of my devices because I just came here on a whim. Something told me to make a stop here. I was actually shopping at 1984 Vintage and Horror, which is literally 5 minutes away from here, like a 5-minute walk, but something told me to come here. So let's try using the ghost box. I am very apprehensive of using these devices, but let's try it.
So I used the Ghostbox app, and it generated an image that I'll show right here. So I have no idea what this means. If anybody recognizes anything, let me know in the comments. I didn't get anything in the voice box session. Nothing came through. But regardless, I would highly make it an effort to come and visit and actually take a tour. They do offer tours once a month. They have their schedule posted on their Facebook, which is really nice. And I'm thinking about maybe stopping by. But if anybody has had an experience at the Adobe, leave me a comment. There's one gentleman from one of my investigations that did inform me he had an experience here. But also let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in doing a little outside sidewalk investigation for one of my public investigations that will soon pick up in late April. Always remember to stay haunted and weird, especially my friends in the 818.
On the afternoon of Saturday, February 6th, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lelu set up the ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could smell the beef bourguignon simmering on the stove, but Alan and the 37-year-old woman who was cooking the beef bourguignon were not talking. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and Alan had actually bought this house for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra used to be Alan's assistant, but over the years, they had developed a really close relationship that was much more like father to daughter. Now, Alexandra had not worked for Alan in a number of years, but, they remained close. And also, remember, Alan literally bought her this house. And so as a result of this bond they had, Alan found himself visiting her quite a bit at this house, helping out where he could. And he also paid for her car and also for their vacations. And Alan could afford to be this generous because he was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a huge moneymaker in France. Lots of companies booked circus shows for end-of-the-year parties for their employees, and Alan had lots of major contracts. And so as a result, Alan's office was in this fancy chateau in the countryside, and his wife actually lived in this luxury ski town near the Swiss border, and Alan was constantly traveling all over Europe for work. But this life could also be a grind. Just in the past 24 hours, Alan had traveled more than 1,200 miles, meeting with potential clients and scouting new performers. So he put a lot of value on the time where he could escape to Alexandra's house, where he could recharge in the quiet of the suburbs, and obviously spend time with somebody he cared a lot about. Now, Alan knew all of his friends and coworkers thought that he and Alexandra were blatantly having an affair here, and he was sure that's what his own wife assumed too. And this was fair, because after all, Alan did have lots of extramarital relationships. He also engaged with sex workers all the time, and he really didn't even try to hide any of it. He and his wife, Elizabeth, they lived in separate homes, and they sort of had this understanding that she can have this life, and he can have this life in exchange. However, Alan's relationship with Alexandra really was different. It had always been platonic. They'd never even kissed or held hands. Alan had no kids of his own, and he genuinely enjoyed playing the role of, doting father and grandfather to Alexandra and her daughter respectively. But now they were in this big fight, and Alan was anxious to repair it. Alexandra's daughter was out of the house for the weekend, so he and Alexandra had planned to have this nice dinner tonight before Alan had to head out again on business on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, somewhat stupidly, had brought up Alexandra's past, and they'd ended up getting into this horrible fight and just continued to yell at each other ever since. Alexandra was very defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris and she had fallen in love and she had had a baby, but the baby had tragically died, and her relationship with her love had fallen apart, and so she had spiraled into very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan finally met her in 2002, so this is 8 years before they were in this house having this big fight, Alexandra was really struggling. By this point, she had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was really struggling to provide for her because all she could muster in terms of work was like this combination of minimum wage jobs and side hustles. And so when Alan had hired her as his, full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. But, deep down, sometimes she seemed more resentful of Alan's power than grateful for his help. It's like he had total control over her well-being, and she didn't necessarily like that. And so with that as context, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen, hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could actually have a real conversation here. And so once he was in the kitchen, he sort of looked over at Alexandra and couldn't really tell where she was at, and then he turned, opened up the fridge, and just kind of stared inside of it, not really looking for any food or drink or anything. He was just hoping that Alexandra would say something to him. And to his relief, Alexandra did turn around and kind of playfully swung her dish towel at him, telling him that he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad at him anymore, so Alan felt very relieved, and he smiled and closed the fridge, and then he told her to come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the laundry to dry so she could iron it. A few minutes later, they both sat down on the sofa with their wine glasses, and Alexandra asked Alan how business was going. He told her it was good, which technically it was. His company was on track to bring in around 4 million euros that year, which is the equivalent of about $5 million US. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was pretty stressed. He made the majority of his money through contracts with companies, but he was not the only person competing for those lucrative contracts. His number one competitor was another circus owner whose name was Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been beating Alan on one contract after another. And it was starting to feel to Alan like Michel was actually targeting Alan's contracts, trying to steal them from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own clients. Alan told Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, which is a city in central France about a 4-hour drive south of Alexandra's house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to win a big contract, as long as Michel didn't steal it out from under him. Alexandra put her hand on Alan's arm and told him, "Don't worry." She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success and they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip that he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to go do the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan just kind of sat by himself for a minute. He was looking forward to the vacation that she had mentioned, in part because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately with her new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Now, Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that, Alexandra and Yves were getting pretty serious. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that eventually, if that happened, Yves might start to resent him for sort of stepping in as this paternal figure in Alexandra's life, that perhaps he would come off as being sort of overbearing. But he was not going to let that fear wreck the evening. So as Alexandra came back now with the laundry, picked up a book from the coffee table, and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, headed back out of town. But what no one would realize until much later was there was actually a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard the voice of Alan's assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried, and she said she was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. And this was pretty strange, because Alan was not the type of person to just disappear from work without telling his secretary. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. And then she asked Sylvie, why? What's going on here? And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's answer, she felt herself growing really nervous. Because apparently, Alan had this very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had not shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he was supposed to be staying. Sylvie said she had already reached out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he was not answering the repeated phone calls to both of his cell phones, which appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days on his various phones. She couldn't even recall a time when he'd been unreachable, even briefly. So Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she called, but she would take it from here. Then Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and called the police. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres in northern France. Now, up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case, with the local police in Alan's wife's hometown handling the inquiry, which was pretty basic. But now, enough time had passed without Alan being found and no evidence coming in that the original report had been kicked over to the crime division because they were thinking this could potentially be a kidnapping or something worse. This young officer was here at this home because it was the last place Alan was known to be before he went missing. The door of the home opened and a thin blonde woman looked out. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she said yes. When he explained to her why he was there, Alexandra looked immediately concerned and invited him inside. And as she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking stock of the space. It was clean, but a bit cluttered, with toys that appeared to belong to a young girl scattered about. The officer scanned for any signs of a physical fight or violence of some kind, like damage to the walls or the furniture, but there was nothing that stood out, nothing concerning. Alexandra began asking the officer pretty anxiously all these questions about, what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What do you know? But the young officer just shook his head and said, for now, they really didn't know much. He was just here to try to build a timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to rattle off all the details she could remember. She said that Alan was like a surrogate father to her, and he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had been there on Friday, also on Saturday and Sunday, and then he had taken off on that Sunday because he had to go to Vichy for this big meeting on Monday. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but that was pretty typical. She said their relationship was not remotely romantic, it really was platonic. And, he didn't always check in the way, a spouse would. This is more like really close friends. The officer nodded while he wrote down what she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and appropriately worried, but he was suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved at all. So, before he left, he asked to see the rest of her house, in part just to see what her reaction would be. If she said no or got defensive, he would probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed, and she actually took him all around the house, showing him anywhere he wanted to go. And what he found is the rest of the house seemed just as normal as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the door and promised him she would call if Alan reached out. And so after leaving Alexandra's house, to be thorough, the officer actually went door to door up and down Alexandra's street, asking her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend and over the past several days, seeing if there was anything that contradicted what Alexandra had said. But everybody more or less confirmed Alexandra's story. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question and said that really nothing had seemed off. So eventually, the officer just left and went back to the station, and when he got there, he wrote a report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, followed up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Alan's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions, which all showed no activity after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and his friends, but no one had heard anything. And they even put in a request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Alan's car, which was an Audi Q7.
Might have known the story of real-life boogeyman.
In fact, he rarely seemed to spend more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, he seemed to bounce between his office and a series of hotels, with stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she said that Alan was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so this made her the last person to see Alan alive, which, in Martin's mind, clearly made her a suspect right off the bat. However, Alexandra's story about Alan leaving her house on Sunday, February 6th, matched up with the data Martin had from Alan's car, cell phone, and credit card records, which all showed that Alan really did leave her house and went to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons unknown, stopped communicating or spending money. Maybe that was the day he was killed. Right off the bat, like the police officer who originally visited Alexandra and took down her original story, Detective Martin found it pretty hard to believe that her relationship with Alan was not romantic. It just seemed like, based on how frequently they apparently saw each other and the fact that Alan was buying her things and, bought her house and paid for vacations and things like that, it just seemed like there was more to the story than what he had been told. But even though that did totally cast some level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just a logical side of it for Detective Martin, which is like, okay, the size difference between Alan and Alexandra was stark. I mean, Alan was 240 pounds, a really big guy, and Alexandra was just very small and petite. Now, is it impossible for her to kill him and put him in the trunk of the car in Orleans? No. But it just makes it sort of unlikely. And so that's just sort of floating in the background of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Alan's business associates and wife had supplied. First off, Alan apparently had lots of affairs with lots of women. And so that meant every one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners of any kind connected to them, were also suspects. It also meant that Alan's wife, Elizabeth, had a motive to want her husband dead. I mean, basically, he's cheating on her openly all the time. That's got to be motivation for her to do something to him. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth literally would have done the killing herself, because she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband died. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman. And the second thing that Detective Martin got from the associates and from Alan's wife was Alan's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Alan's employees and colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless business person. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had already made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was flying around. And so because Martin had been handed this murder investigation, and really there's like an overwhelming number of people that could have been involved here, instead of just, not being sure where to start, Martin just assembled a team of his very best deputies, and they set to work literally re-interviewing everybody, and from that, making a list of suspects that they deemed were appropriate. Three weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station, and he sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and apparently very calmly. The man's name was Michel de la Rue, and he was Alan's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anybody else's. And this was because, immediately after Alan disappeared, Michel had begun contacting Alan's clients, trying to get them to all sign new contracts with him, sort of a pretty cutthroat and cold thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on these contracts Michel was going for, and they added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which in the detective's mind was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel killed this guy specifically to gobble up these contracts. And not only that, but the coroner had by this point come back with Alan's cause of death. He had been strangled using some kind of ligature, like a rope or a belt, and it likely took between 5 and maybe 10 minutes for Alan to actually be strangled to death. So the idea is someone's actively strangling him for that long. That is a long time to be right there on top of somebody killing someone. And then the scratches that were found on Alan's legs suggested that his body had been lifted into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, clearly took place outside of the trunk. And so all that meant whoever killed Alan had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he did fit the description. He seemed like a pretty fit, strong guy. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and body language for signs of anxiety or defensiveness that could suggest he was hiding something, what he found was Michel seemed pretty open and very straightforward, like he was not hiding a thing. Michel immediately acknowledged poaching Alan's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. That was business. He said he was sure if somehow the positions were reversed, Alan would do the same thing to him. And also, he said he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Alan had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away skiing. And then Michel produced this folder full of these receipts and all these phone numbers, and he handed it over to Martin, who took it, and he told Michel, okay, sit tight. And then the detective got up and he left the interrogation room and he handed over this folder to another detective to check out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to take a shot. The idea was to sort of have a good cop, bad cop sort of dynamic to see if maybe that would rattle Michel. And so Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and took a stab at, breaking Michel. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So Martin signaled for another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a sort of run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel, and they didn't make any progress. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. And when he turned around, it was one of his deputies who told Martin that unfortunately he had called all the people that Michelle had given them information for, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had also even called the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michelle's alibi checked out. He clearly had not been physically able to kill Alan. He was at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he could not just keep Michelle indefinitely and just keep trying to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some possibility here that he was involved in this murder, at this point, there just wasn't enough evidence. And so he had to let Michelle go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk combing through reports when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was somebody at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. And this was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local papers basically saying, hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me. And he hoped that whoever this was potentially a witness. And so Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby, and there he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was this man who appeared to be in his early 50s, who was dressed all in black with these shiny black shoes and glasses. And Martin wondered if maybe this was a business contact of Alan's. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then this man introduced himself, and when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. Because the man said his name was Remy Saint-Touren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy to, thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this. You need to go. But then he thought better of it, because Martin was really having no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints. And while the bedsheet Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their system. And then the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either, and he'd found no evidence that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles took out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and all the sex workers he had engaged with, and none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little curiosity and a lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy the psychic back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving, and when he heard it, he had a vision that was so vivid that he actually had to pull over. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day in this physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her, but he was certain that a woman was somehow involved in Alan's murder. Martin was disappointed because, unsurprisingly, this just sort of felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody parading around as a psychic who could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw this random generic thing out there as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orleans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and actually placed in the trunk after he was dead. And this caught Martin's attention, because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transportation. But critically, the police had not released that information to the press, specifically because they wanted to be able to weed out fake tips. And so for Remy to say that, how would he have access to that? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy, but it just seemed so, on the nose that he began considering what else Remy had said. This idea that, okay, Alan was struggling with this woman. That was something that, Martin had not really considered. He had sort of ruled most women out as the potential suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical this murder had to have been. So it just seemed more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly it seemed entirely possible that, you know what? Maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And then after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk. Because Martin had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had lots of extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy, it was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew, clearly, that Alan engaged with sex workers. It just seemed like that was one of the things that he did, and they spoke to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as being suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as, primary suspect pool. However, now with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans was because he was there to meet a sex worker, and while he was there, something went wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and business records, but Martin was looking at something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to go visit. Basically, what he was doing is making a true exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever really engaged with. So this is an even bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through, and as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to Orleans, and they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came to one new profile, this woman named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was and got a picture of her and saw her information, he knew right then and there he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Leloup on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer, just because he was this powerful businessman.
Did you ever hear about the Fresno Nightcrawler? Now, the Fresno Nightcrawler was this really strange creature. First appeared in 2007. There was this man in Fresno, California. He films this strange creature walking through his yard on a security camera. And it basically looked like two skinny, tall legs with a head attached. There was like no torso, no middle part of the body. It was just a head with legs. And it was completely white. And that was the first of many reports of the Fresno Nightcrawler. And it's often described as basically a long pair of legs with a head. And most people don't even see the face. It almost just looks like two legs walking. It's described as being pale. A lot of times it's associated with screaming and yelling or even crying. And it's often seen at night outside of people's homes, wandering through their yards. There's been reports all over the world, in Poland, in Yosemite, and even South America. Now, there was a story that came out of the Mount Shasta area. There was this man, he lived near the forest. And he said one night he was awoken to the sound of this crying. And he said it was coming from the woods behind his house. So he grabbed a flashlight and he went outside thinking maybe someone was hurt. And he starts yelling, is anyone there? Does anybody need any help? And that's when he sees these two long, skinny legs with some sort of head attached to it walk right by him. Goes over to the wall of his house, and it started to crawl up the side of the house. He said it got all the way up to the second story, and this thing just turned its sort of head, and it started hissing at him. So he ran in the house, and he calls his friend, come over here, like there's something strange going on, like you need to come here. And he said when his friend got there, they both went outside, they looked all over, but they couldn't find this thing. And he said still, sometimes at night, he hears these strange screams or these crying sounds coming from the backyard behind his house. So is the Fresno Nightcrawler real? Did you ever hear about the Fresno Nightcrawler? Now, the Fresno Nightcrawler was this really strange creature. First appeared in 2007. There was this man in Fresno, California. He films this strange creature walking through his yard on a security camera. And it basically looked like two skinny, tall legs with a head attached. There was like no torso, no middle part of the body. It was just a head with legs. And it was completely white. And that was the first of many reports of the Fresno Nightcrawler. And it's often described as basically a long pair of legs with a head. And most people don't even see the face. It almost just looks like two legs walking. It's described as being pale. A lot of times it's associated with screaming and yelling or even crying. And it's often seen at night outside of people's homes wandering through their yards. There's been reports all over the world, in Poland, in Yosemite, and even South America. Now, there was a story that came out of the Mount Shasta area. There was this man, he lived near the forest. And he said one night he was awoken to the sound of this crying. And he said it was coming from the woods behind his house. So he grabbed a flashlight and he went outside thinking maybe someone was hurt. And he starts yelling, is anyone there? Does anybody need any help? And that's when he sees these two long, skinny legs with some sort of head attached to it walk right by him. Goes over to the wall of his house, and it started to crawl up the side of the house. He said it got all the way up to the second story, and this thing just turned its sort of head, and it started hissing at him. So he ran in the house, and he calls his friend, come over here, like there's something strange going on, like you need to come here. And he said when his friend got there, they both went outside, they looked all over, but they couldn't find this thing. And he said still, sometimes at night, he hears these strange screams or these crying sounds coming from the backyard behind his house. So is the Fresno Nightcrawler real?
Okay, I think that by now we all know not to mess around with one of these. These were some comments left by some people who unfortunately did not take the warning seriously. Story number 1. Shortly after Kelly and her husband had started to play with the board, they realized that they had made a huge mistake. Not long after, they started having horrible nightmares about both of them being set on fire and dragged too. So their 2-year-old son also started having the same nightmares. On one occasion, the nightmare was so severe that it caused her son to think that he was actually in a house that had been set on fire. So much so that he felt the need to climb out of his second-story window in order to save himself. Thankfully, Kelly and her husband were able to get to him in time. Story number 2. When I was a kid, my aunt decided that she was going to play with the board one night. For whatever reason, she really did not like what the board had to say, so she decided to take it outside and set it on fire. The next morning when she woke up, the board was sitting on her coffee table completely untouched, as if she had never set it on fire. And story number 4, I used to play with the Ouija board non-stop without absolutely anything really happening to me until the last time when I played with it, it said, "Watch for the kitchen." A couple hours later, all of the cabinets and all of the drawers in the kitchen opened up and all of the dishes flew out. I have not touched a Ouija board since. Let me know if you guys want a part 2.
Weird spooky story time, and this was a comment left in my Gilroy Outlet story. So this was a comment left by Shannon, and she said, "We all have experiences. We hear our names when alone in the store, black shadows moving quickly. I've had shoes from the top shelves fall on me when alone, clothes fly out of the boxes on high shelves when alone. I was standing speaking with a new hire, and a skateboard fell off a hook on my face. Once I said, "This music sucks. I'd rather it be silent." And right then the music shut off. We have mobile metal racks and sometimes they move by themselves. We had a kid come running out from back room and he was pale and shaking and he said he saw a gremlin run across the back room. We were so scared we had to leave. What if this was a duende? I always think everything's a duende, but I'm telling you, everything's a duende. A little gremlin? Like, what else could that be? Like, some type of gnome figure? Like, what does he mean by a gremlin? Like, did it look like a little person? Did it look like a little monster? Oh my god, I have so many questions. Is this at Vans? I haven't been to the Gray Outlets for a really long time, but I mean, this must be a skate store. Let me know in the comments what you guys think, or if anyone else has seen like a little gremlin-like figure, please send me your story.
We listen, we don't get scared, and we don't judge. Let me give you guys a story time of when my cousin dated this girl who had a dad who was busy with witchcraft, and he broke this girl's heart, and then the dad sent stuff to follow him. So my cousin hit puberty, and then started thinking about girls, and he started dating multiple girls, and then I think at this time he was like 17 years and he was still dating multiple girls. I do not have a problem because, what could I possibly do, he would tell me about his girlfriends and I'd just be like, boys are not good people. And so there was this time where he started dating this particular girl, which again, it was not a problem to me until one day my mom and my grandmother were talking about that girl's dad. And the conversation, my mom was like, it's so common for women to be called witches, but when men are called witches, it's kind of weird. Because I don't know what my mom was looking at. I think it was a newspaper article or something. You know how Daily Sun used to be back in the day? No problem. So my grandma's like, yeah, but then there is a male witch like in the village, whatever. And my mom is like, who? So my grandma tells my mom that no, Mr. So-and-so, which is my cousin's girlfriend's dad, is a witch. Apparently there was this man that went to work one time and he had been seeking a job for the longest time, and then eventually he found a job. And when he found the job, at the job, I don't know what he was doing. I think he was picking up heavy things, and that thing fell on his foot and he was unable to go to work for a couple of days because he almost had lost his job. But because they went to a traditional healer, the traditional healer told him that you have a very close friend that does not want you to win in life. The very close friend obviously being Mr. So-and-so, because this man had come and told my grandmother so that he can warn my grandmother to stay away from Mr. So-and-so, because my grandmother, I was kind of cool with him. So he was just there hey, I'm just here to warn you, Mr. So-and-so is not a good person. This is what he had done. And they found out from that traditional healer that Mr. So-and-so didn't want this man to work. He didn't want him to be good in life. And finally God said yes and gave him a job. And Mr. So-and-so was like, there is no way you are getting a job. And then obviously he tried to make him lose that job and lose his legs so that he's not able to find any other job. And yeah, I told my cousin the story. I'm like, dog, you better be careful with this girl. He was like, the dad may be a witch doctor, but I don't think the dad knows that the child is dating. My cousin, guys, dated this girl for I don't know how long. And I remember when we came back again, the second time for holidays, he had told me that he had started seeing a shadow, right? So he tells me that he's not sure, but then him and Mr. So-and-so's daughter got into it because Mr. So-and-so's daughter caught him cheating with another girl, and he did not want to leave the other girl because the other girl was a new girlfriend and she was an old girlfriend. He had experienced it, he's good with her, he just wants to continue with the other girl. And Mr. So-and-so's daughter made him choose, and he chose the other girl. And he's ever since then, he has not seen the light of day. He feels like something is following him and all of that. Now, the only reason we had this conversation was because we were walking next to his mom's place, right? And it's uphill. He keeps on looking back, what's going on? What are you looking at? Sometimes he flinches, and I'm just like, what are you looking at? Are you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm fine, And then we're walking, and then sometimes he asks me if I can hear that, a snake is hissing around us, and I'd be like, no. And then he'd start running like a madman, or sometimes we would be chilling, Guys, and all of this happened in broad daylight. We would be chilling and he would tell you that, can you hear that dog barking? And I'd be like, there's no dog barking here, there's only goats. And he'd be like, I'm serious, there's a dog that's barking. And then he would go inside the house and cover himself with his blankets. Be like, guy, what's going on with you? And apparently it got worse because obviously we had left. And he refused to tell his mom what's going on. So I was like, hey, I can't help you if you don't tell your mom what's happening. It got worse, y'all. Apparently he used to hear things in the classroom. You know, he would think that something is, like, they say, the last straw was when he was sitting alone in class. Well, not alone, but he did not have a desk mate. So his bag was on the chair. And, you know, the teacher is teaching. A boy started screaming that somebody's sitting next to him. And he kept on asking him, like, why are you following me and all of that? And obviously, you know, it got, like, really bad. And they had to call his mom. And his mom took him to church. And at church, they told him that you broke somebody's heart. And that girl is a witch just like her daddy. Well, they didn't say her dad. Obviously he figured it was her, right? But they told him that you broke somebody's heart, and that person's dad, that person's parent, one of the parents, is a, you know, practices witchcraft, and you decided to break her heart, and she went and she did you dirty. She wants you to go crazy. Guys, people are deranged out here. Like, what? It was like, that girl wanted you to either come back to her and apologize, or you run mad. And since you were not getting the hints to go and actually apologize to her and maybe get back together, she decided, you know what, I'm gonna let this be until he realizes that he has to apologize. And at that particular church, y'all, they helped him, and then he went back to school, I think. And when he got back to school, the minute the girl realized that her plan didn't work, she kind of started, like, not looking at him in the eye. You know, she started to avoid him. Every time she sees him, she would run away, and she eventually changed schools because I feel like she felt like my cousin knew it was her, of which my cousin did. But had she just remained calm, I don't think my cousin would have confronted her. You know, now she's just giving my cousin that thing, like, showcase, you did it. Do you get what I mean? And so, yeah, like, she changed schools or whatever. And I'm just like, guys, your relationships are deep, but they're not that deep for you to be out here being a witch. Like, as young as you are, like, I still say, kids that are out here practicing witchcraft with their parents is wild.